All right. Well, hi, folks. Welcome and thank you for joining today. Uh, we've got one of our A-Dash webinars as part of our 2024 A-Dash webinar series. This series is designed to help educate and spark conversation and culture shift towards more welcoming outdoor and river-based workspaces free from sexual harassment and discrimination. So thank you for joining us today. Today's session, we're going to be looking at exploring the human elements of your risk management plan. And I'm really excited. We've got two great guests with us today, Gina McClard from Respect Outside and Steve Smith from Experiential Consulting. And I'm just going to go ahead and pass it over to them to introduce themselves and take it away. So thank you all for being here.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Gina McClard. I'm the CEO of Respect Outside, and I use she, her pronouns. And before I do a big introduction for me, I would like to ask for y'all to put your name and the organization you're with in the chat so that we all know who's with us today, because there's not so many folks, so we can kind of see where all of you are coming from. Steve, you want me to just go ahead and keep talking about myself? Yes, great. Okay, so hey everybody, I'm an attorney, and I've been an attorney for the past 30 years. My legal specialty has been broadly gender-based violence prevention. I started my legal career at the Illinois Coalition Against Sexual Assault, providing legal technical assistance to all the rape crisis centers in Illinois. And I moved to the Oregon Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, similarly providing broad legal technical assistance, lobbying, legislative work, all kinds of problem solving for all the rape crisis centers and battered women's shelters in Oregon. From there, I moved to Lewis and Clark Law School, where I was a law professor, and I directed the Crime Victim Litigation Clinic, which, utilizing student research, we helped to change the laws either through the courts or the legislatures in a variety of states all over the country. I haven't been in the outdoor industry long. We started Respect Outside in 2019, and it's been a very interesting journey. I've been training on anti-sexual harassment for 30 years, and it has evolved. It's been very interesting to see sort of the practices and the habits in the outdoor industry and how they might present more challenges than other groups that I have trained in the past. So thank you all for being here, and we're really excited about today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gina. It's a pleasure to be doing this with you, especially. And thanks to A-Dash for inviting me to be a part of this. Welcome, everyone. It's good to see lots of folks here on the call. My name is Steve Smith, he, him pronouns. I am zooming in from Whidbey Island in Washington State, where I can oddly see the sun outside my window today. It's very exciting. I'm a consultant and the founder of Experiential Consulting. We are a risk management consultancy that uniquely works with outdoor and experiential education programs like outdoor education, conservation corps, wilderness therapy, independent schools, and organizations like all of yours. When we work on safety with folks, it's not just physical and medical safety, but it's also psychological safety and managing risk to the organizations themselves. My background comes from lots of different outdoor focused organizations like Outward Bound, where I've been involved for 20 plus years. And I was the director of risk management for the Student Conservation Association, which is a nationwide conservation corps working on public lands. And in our approach to this work, we take a positive approach. It's a trauma-informed, research-based approach to risk management. And I think you'll see that come out in some of the topics that we talk about today. So yeah, it's really good to be here with you folks. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Gina.
Yeah. So whenever we talk about difficult subjects, and we will be talking about sexual harassment and other unwanted conduct at work, I always like to put up the National Sexual Assault Hotline. I know statistically we've probably got survivors on the call today. So if you feel like you would like more information or more resources, please do call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673. They aren't just a sexual assault hotline. They have broader information and sexual harassment resources as well. So take care of yourself. And if you feel like you need a break, take one. Okay, so we have a lot of information to share. We have only an hour, and we want to reserve about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end. So unless you have a burning question, if you have a clarifying question, please do put that in the chat so that we can amend anything we're saying to make it more clear. But for the most part, if you would share or if you would hold your questions till the end, that would be great. Help us get through our materials, and then we can have a nice, interesting conversation on the backside with your questions. So Steve, I'm going to let you do the outcomes.
Fantastic. So the things that we're looking to focus on today is helping all of you understand that we are not just focused on physical safety with our risk management strategies. That psychological safety is, I would say not only an equally important part of that, but a interdependent part of that. And we'll talk about what we mean by that. We want to focus on not just avoiding sexual harassment, but the bigger pointing positive behaviors that will help you have a healthy organizational culture, as well as discussing the role of policies and procedures for a just, timely, and restorative response when incidents do occur. So
let's
go ahead. You go.
Well, I was just going to say, we're going to start now talking about a culture of safety. And when I first was in the outdoor industry and started doing my research to see how it lined up with previous work I had done in other arenas, I was really happy to see that there's so much focus on safety in the outdoor industry, and thought easily that is where I would use that as a starting point to talk about not only, of course, preventing sexual harassment, but also the broader spectrum of other unwanted, not illegal behaviors, but to utilize that as leverage point. But I found that psychological safety was interestingly left out. And so I wanted to ask you, Steve, having been in risk management and in this world for so long, I was so curious, why is there an absence of psychological safety in a lot of what we see in the outdoor industry?
Yeah, wonderful. I would say that has really evolved over the ages, and that it sort of mirrors our own society's increasing and recent recognition of the importance of things like mental health that weren't always so present and so evident, and in fact were sort of stigmatized in the past as even a topic that we could talk about, right? So briefly, I'd say that the outdoor industry has kind of gone through different eras. And in the early days, big organizations like the Boy Scouts or Outward Bound or Knowles were really just focused on developing and growing their programs. And that was sort of the main focus of the risk management systems, was just getting the foundational things in place. And as more and more people started to go through the programs and incidents occurred, there was sort of a shift of focus more to liability avoidance, wanting to manage legal cases and liability and getting sued for accidents and things like this. All this is still focusing pretty neatly on physical safety so far, you might notice, right? And then there was sort of a beautiful evolution of that thinking where people started to realize, the reason we're running these rivers or climbing these mountains is not to avoid lawsuits. Like, that's not why we started our company. And we have a bigger purpose in mind. So the focus became really on quality programming. And realizing that if we run quality programs, that in many cases, that helps us to manage the liability that we might otherwise have. And then we've more recently kind of entered into this newer age where I would say the focus has much more shifted to include topics like mental health and equity and inclusion and psychological safety. And so, that sort of mirrors some changes that have happened in society as a whole. And so, if we put it in that historical context, we could understand it. And just speaking from my personal experience, I'll briefly say when I started, working as an outward bound instructor back in the 90s, I diligently trained wilderness first responder classes, and I learned how to deal with head injuries and gory, sucking chest wounds and broken legs and all these things. But no one taught me how to deal with, depression and anxiety and suicidal ideation and bullying or harassment, or a lot of things that actually were just as important then as they are now. And now, fortunately, our industry has kind of grown up a bit, and people, in addition to taking something like wilderness first responder, we now have the opportunity to take something like mental health first aid, and also to look at the relationship between our equity and inclusion goals and our risk management system. So I'd say the industry is learning and growing up, but maybe too fast for some and way too slow for others is sort of how I see that going, Gina.
Yeah, that's interesting because when I like I said, got into the working in the outdoor industry and started looking at the safety issue, I was very confused why it seemed there was this bifurcation between physical and psychological safety. And from my perspective, I really chalked it up to the fact that the outdoor industry and time immemorial adventurers and explorers were all very homogeneous. They were all white men. And I'm curious about if you agree with this, Steve, that I was thinking, well, in these kind of early days of the outdoor industry, when everybody is of the a majority status individual, a white male, there was just less emphasis on the psychological aspect of somebody's being, that it might have been seen as weak. And therefore, we're not going to talk about it because we don't want weak people out on the mountain with us. And my impression was that we weren't looking at psychological safety because we were just trying to get at the big, egregious injuries and make sure everyone gets off the mountain safely and alive. And if we've done that, check, we've done what we needed to do. And all these other issues are softer concerns that we rugged outdoorsmen don't want to have to deal with because we don't deal with it in our own lives. Can't imagine there was a lot of sexual harassment with Hillary on Everest. And so I'm curious what you think about that, Steve.
Yeah, even I love your reference to the softer side of it, and even the language that I see organizations continuing to use sort of arises from those early days of sort of a white male dominated industry, in terms of, we refer to technical skills as hard skills, and we refer to group facilitation and conflict resolution and feedback and stuff like that as soft skills. And I can't tell you how many times I have seen really technically skilled, tough, experienced mountaineers completely unable to do what we call the soft skills. Are they really soft? Are they in fact harder than some of the so-called hard skills? So I think all these things are just sort of illustrations, of the point that you're bringing up, and the way that we talk about that stuff. The language matters, and I do think it can perpetuate some of those outdated ways of thinking about the role of emotional and psychological safety in our risk management priorities.
Right. Circles back to the title of this webinar, because soft skills are human skills, and oftentimes they're much harder than the physical skills.
Yeah.
I'm curious if we can circle back to the mental health track in the woofer training. Why isn't it all just encompassed in training about safety and whether that's psychological or physical?
Great question. I would say we're in a growing phase with that, or a growing pain. I'm glad that there are mental health first aid trainings and a curriculum that, that is establishing itself there. But the wilderness medical curriculum has really been developed and refined and even agreed upon and codified, by different organizations over decades. And I don't think that able or that interested in just quickly bolting on all this mental health stuff to that established curriculum. So while I totally agree that, having a first aid training that looks at the whole person, not just their resting heart rate and their blood pressure, but actually the whole person, that would be a great place for the industry to go. I would say that the community that's responsible for developing those trainings haven't quite fully gotten there yet. And so at this point, and if anyone out there knows differently, please correct me if I'm wrong, but at this point, those are kind of living in different silos and growing up in different places. And you can take things like, there are trainings like behavioral first responder or mental health first aid trainings and things like that, that are ways to build out that aspect of your ability to work with people's psychological safety, but it is not neatly integrated into what we currently think of as the 8 or 10 day long wilderness first responder class that is actually already pretty stuffed, full of just the medical stuff.
Yes. Well, good. Hopefully that we're going to have some evolution in that, like
Yep.
we do in most places.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So how about physical and psychological safety? How do they depend on each other?
Yeah, great. So yeah, I would say that in these next couple slides, we're going to look at some different ways, a personal level, a group level, and an organizational level on how they depend on each other. But before we do that, let's just offer a definition. We're throwing out terms like a culture of safety and psychological safety. And there are many ways to define those things, but we pulled one here from a really excellent resource, MIT professor Edgar Schein, who actually recently passed away. And he's been an incredibly influential researcher and author in the topic of organizational culture. So we're going to share some of his books and resources with you at the end. But Schein tells us that a culture, an organizational culture, is a pattern of shared basic assumptions that a group learns as it solves its problems of external adaptation and internal integration, which has worked well enough within that organization to be considered valid and to be taught to new members as the correct way to perceive, think, and feel in relation to those problems. So it's a little bit of an academic definition, but as long as we're throwing around these ideas of like organizational culture, we thought we'd offer you a way to define it. And if that's intriguing to you, we'll offer some information about Edgar's book at the end of this presentation. You want me to just keep going here, Gina, with this part?
Absolutely.
So Kelsey is mentioning in the chat that there was a higher focus on mental health. And that's great. Thanks, Kelsey, for sharing that. They definitely know it, and they get that it's a missing part, right? But they haven't really, fully integrated that into the curriculum. Like I think they eventually will sort of have to.
Sure. Because I hope that it's not bifurcated such that it's the lesser, it's the soft skills, and let's encourage the girls to go and do the mental health track, right?
Right. Yeah. Or to imply that we don't work with a therapeutic population in our organization, in this sort of post-COVID, like really socio-politically complex era that we live in. Like we're all in a therapeutic population at this point, is kind of how it feels to me. So getting back to this question of how interdependent physical safety and psychological safety can be, this slide captures it pretty simply. If you are in a group and you're going down the river and you're being physically injured all the time, it's probably pretty hard for you to be psychologically safe in that group. Likewise, and this is the important shift, if you're not psychologically safe in that group, meaning if you can't be your authentic self, if you can't speak up when you have a concern, if you feel like you can't raise your concerns or voice your opinions without some kind of fear of retribution or punishment or consequences, social or otherwise, if you can't bring up those needs and concerns, then as a result, you may not be physically safe, right? You may see things going on that you're concerned about, but you're afraid to speak up about. And that can obviously cause not just psychological, but physical safety concerns. So the ability to like voice your needs, speak up, all those things really helps on a personal level. If we extrapolate to the next level out, the group level, like let's imagine a group going through the mountains or backpacking or going down the river. Studies have shown that groups make safer decisions when everyone's voice is included. It doesn't mean that it's democratic or that they're voting on like how to run a certain rapid. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a democratic process of decision making, but simply making a space where everyone's voice can be heard as part of the decision making process, even if there's like ultimately an autonomous leader making the decisions, that leads to better decisions. Interestingly, a group with no leader at all tends to make better and safer decisions than an autonomous group that's not listening to anyone else's input. So that's interesting. And you can find that in studies of avalanche safety and group dynamics and stuff like that. So the idea there is making a safe space for people to speak up. Finally, I'll give you a moment to just gaze at and absorb this image, starting at the top. Start with human error and go all the way around, and then we'll talk about it. So this model, the blame cycle, comes to us from safety author James Reason, and he first kind of coined this back in the 80s. But it's predicated on an idea of an organizational culture where human error is seen as this awful thing that we're trying to completely eliminate altogether. So when someone makes a mistake of any sort, that individual is counseled or disciplined. That can lead to a loss of trust by that person who made the error or who reported themselves for the error. That can lead them to suppress reporting or sharing or speaking up when they have concerns in the future. As a result, insidiously, the management is then less aware. The bosses are not hearing the bad news about what's really happening, right? So conditions get worse, organizational weaknesses persist. There's more possibilities for things to go wrong, and then that leads insidiously leads to more human errors, right? So there's this sort of unvirtuous cycle that's happening in the blame cycle, where when we see people as a problem and when we try to blame people instead of learning from incidents and events, that let's see, yeah, thanks for muting yourself there. That can really just create the opposite of what the management really wants, which is a safer workplace. Let's look at the next slide as a counterpoint to that. So more recently, I learned this from a psychologist named Clive Lloyd. I do not know if he was the originator of this model, but it's called the trust loop. And instead of seeing people as a problem, we start by seeing people as solutions. When something occurs or when they report a concern or an event happens or an incident or a near miss, we can focus on the relationship with that person. The first question might be, are you okay? Instead of asking, how were you so stupid? How did you make that mistake, right? And try to pursue it in a humble way to understand, how did those decisions make sense to you at the time? What pressures were you facing that led to that chain of events? That can lead to increased trust and learning. It can make a more psychologically safe workplace, and it can intrinsically make the kind of space where people speak up when they see something that's wrong. They can report near misses. They can be included in the safety management process. And as a result, that comes back to the top again in this virtuous cycle where we can continue to collaborate as members of a team and see people as solutions rather than see people as the cause of our safety problems. Now, having said all this, this all sounds good, but I will say that this doesn't work when you have untrustworthy or abusive people kind of hiding. I see some heads nodding. This trust loop doesn't work if you allow people to abuse the system, right? And so, Gina, I don't know if you want to jump in and sort of problematize that at all, but the trust loop is I will say hard to build, but easy to break down if you're allowing people to abuse each other or abuse that system.
From a sexual harassment perspective, we know that the number one reason why people choose not to report unwanted conduct that they perceive or that they experience is because they don't trust that they will be believed, or they don't trust that the organization will do anything about it. So it's so interesting. Your two slides here really show just how important trust is. And so encouraging folks to speak up can be great. But if you don't formalize it, if you don't codify that request and put it in your policies and procedures so that you have this communication feedback, you show your employees that you do want to hear from them, and that you have a structure on how they can speak up safely, because it can be intimidating just to ask your employees to speak up when they see things that are uncomfortable or unwanted. And we know from the research that not only does trust get diminished when you experience unwanted behavior or when you experience discrimination or harassment, but trust also gets eroded when you witness it. So the law covers both, victims of sexual harassment and witnesses of sexual harassment or discrimination, because the idea is that you are eroding your organizational's culture by eroding the trust. And we both know, like, trust is the hardest thing to build, and it's just so easy to break down. So why don't we advance to the next slide, and I'll just make a segue here. See what that's doing? It seems like, okay, there we go. Great. So I just wanted to step back and say that, I've been training folks on preventing sexual harassment for 30 years. There hasn't really been much research on what works and what doesn't work. We found that for the most part, the research that I've seen from 10 years ago was that basically, if you just have a bare bones sexual harassment training, most likely you may lose people who were relatively neutral on the topic, but after they go through a training that isn't applicable either to the industry or the workplace specifically, you may find that people have more resentment than they have education from your training. But one of the things that we have seen from the social science research since Me Too, when there was a bit of influx of money, was that if you are just approaching these harassment, discriminatory behaviors at that point, after you've actually seen them, you are making the road to having a workplace free of those things much more difficult for yourself. Because the idea is that there's a lot of bad behavior that happens that isn't illegal, that we don't categorize as sexual harassment or sexual discrimination. So we like to advance this idea that you look at the macro aspect of unwanted behavior in the workplace, and that there's an escalation of unwanted behaviors. It doesn't all start just at sexual harassment or discrimination. And as you can see from this slide, the very origins of the unwanted behavior start with incivility or disrespectful conduct. So interrupting people, rolling your eyes, huffing when you hear something you disagree with, treating your peers in different ways. So saying hello to the folks in the break room that you really get along with, and absolutely ignoring folks that you don't care for. These microaggressions would be something that are in this category, so that we're learning from the research that resentment, discomfort, erosion of trust happens when people either experience this incivility or they witness the incivility. But the bigger thing that we know from this research is that those individuals who are exercising this disrespectful behavior are seeking out power and control in their workplace. Because we know sexual harassment isn't about sex, it's about power and control. And so when you find that you have an environment in your organization where these smaller, not illegal, disrespectful conducts are allowed to exist, nobody calls them out, nobody says this is unwanted, the individual who's perpetrating that behavior gets the idea that nobody cares here. I am free to continue on this path to whatever it is that they are seeking out to find better ways to exert their control in a workplace. And so we see that this disrespectful conduct leads to things like bullying, and then it leads to things like harassment and discrimination, and ultimately workplace violence. So it's so important to understand that when you're talking about psychological safety at work, it really does start much earlier than people think. The egregiousness, the trauma, the disruption to the workplace starts when people either experience or witness incivility. So we know that just with incivility alone, there is a great business case for working on creating this environment where you care about all aspects of behavior, whether it's illegal or not, and you encourage your workforce to speak up when they see something that is unwanted. Let everybody know that they can speak up and stand up for themselves early and without other intervention from their supervisor. And so it's so important to be able to address psychological safety early. We know that when you have a lack of respectful conduct and people, even those who witness it, that there is a decrease in willingness to collaborate or to participate. There's an increase in absenteeism and more utilization of longer sick leave, because people are physically affected by this disrespectful conduct, but they're also psychologically affected first and foremost. And so there is a bigger case for stepping back and taking a look at all the behavior in the workplace and where do these psychologically risky behaviors start. And unfortunately, they start early. So that is what this slide is really about, taking a look at. Don't start looking at a problem when it's already harassment and discrimination, because that is too late. We drive our corporate cultures, or if we don't drive it, it'll drive itself in ways and to places you don't want to go. So let's move on to this one, the challenges of managing psychological safety and the difference between policy and procedure.
Cool. And before we do, I just have one, if we could pop back to that last slide for just a second, I have one little comment to make, which is, thank you, Gina, for sort of outlining that linear sort of escalation of unwelcome behaviors. And if we imagine that blame cycle image kind of floating in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, how might that silence, how might people's inability to speak up, how might their sort of not feeling like it's their place to raise these concerns, how might that contribute, as we escalate from incivility to bullying to harassment? You can see the blame cycle all along those different stages. And then, how might the trust loop actually help combat this? How might, the escalation not be possible from one level to the next if we had an organization that sort of had that trust loop capacity operating within its ecosystem? So I just wanted to share, like, this slide, I think, powerfully shows where the blame cycle helps this escalation, and the trust loop might actually try to nip it in the bud a little earlier. So Gina, I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I just wanted to sort of offer that as something that occurred to me when you brought this slide up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can see if your policies and procedures around unwanted behavior start at harassment, that's really the first place you see anything talking about behavior and any aspects of psychological safety, then that is certainly a big silencing mechanism, because people are going to be like, oh, well, just because somebody came and ignored me in the break room or rolled their eyes at something that I was saying to everyone, or consistently interrupted me, or took credit for my ideas. You fill in the blank on what the non-legal, non-illegal behavior is. I'm going to get the message that people don't want to hear about it. I'm going to shut up. I'm just going to suck it up and go and try to get along in my day and do my job and be so eager to leave when it is the end of the day.
Yeah, it's above my pay grade. I'm not going to get involved in that kind of stuff, right? Cool. So this one is interesting, and we've got a few different little nuggets here. I'm curious for the folks in the participants on this call, and you can pop this into the chat if you like, or just comment in the chat. But does your organization make any distinction between policies and procedures, or do you use those terms interchangeably? Are they the same? Are policies and procedures the same? Sometimes I see organizations talking about policies, procedures, standards, protocols, and they use those terms interchangeably. So I'm curious if you could maybe pop into the chat, are they the same to you, or is there a difference between what a policy requires and what a procedure requires? Curious if people have any comments on that. In my mind, if you're using them interchangeably, then basically everything is a policy, and as a result, nothing is a policy. People are picking and choosing which ones work for them in order to efficiently get their job done in any given day. And I think it's actually really important to be clear what think something along the lines of policies or rules that must be followed unless following the policy makes a less safe situation, something like that. And procedures might be more recommended steps or a sequence of steps that is helpful, but with some latitude for the human beings to critically think and do what's best, for the situation or the environment that they're in or whatever. So, I just want to say, when everything is a policy, nothing is a policy. And, you end up with this phone book of policies and people don't even know what they all say, and they don't necessarily follow them all. So that's problematic. There's another little nuance here, and Gina, you might have views on this to offer, but if an organization this is counterintuitive, but research shows organizations that have zero tolerance policies for certain behaviors, that can backfire if their zero tolerance policy has specific automatic consequences that uniformly apply no matter what the situation is. Because what it does is it forces people to decide, am I really going to turn this person in for what I see as a minor transgression, maybe something lower down on that scale of escalation that Gina showed in the previous slide? Am I really going to turn my supervisor in for what was really just a minor thing? Or am I going to let that go? As opposed to an organization that has a more nuanced, restorative, thoughtful approach to responding to incidents and creating, where appropriate and where possible, creating more of a learning environment than an immediately punitive environment. So that's just an interesting one. It's a little counterintuitive. And Gina, I don't know if I got all those nuances adequately. Do you want to add anything?
Absolutely. No, I just want to say that, I think this came about more in the late 80s and then was really popular in the 90s. But when we're talking about building trust so people feel free to speak up, this is exactly the opposite of what you're encouraging. If you had a zero tolerance policy, but also a policy of, we really want you to work things out first and foremost, and then it is counterintuitive, and it is creating a culture of silence, because people are like, I would like this behavior to stop, but I don't want Chris to have to be fired. And so I see zero tolerance language as a red flag, and always flag it as such.
Excellent. Yeah. Nuance. And, there's a difference between retribution and restoration. And retribution starts with punishment, and restoration starts by asking, what does the victim need? What's going to make them whole from this experience? So that kind of brings us to the next piece that, as we alluded to earlier, this trust loop or culture of psychological safety is very hard to build, and it's very easy to erode the moment someone gets shamed and blamed and punished for reporting something or sharing a concern, or maybe they do report a really valid concern and it's not acted upon in a timely and restorative and useful way. Why would they report it again? Or why would they continue to work there? So, I think it's really hard to build this and easy to erode. And maybe this would be a great place to discuss in our Q&A section, like, what are people thinking and how might these concepts apply, to their organizations? And finally, I'll just share this last bullet point, which comes to us from Diane Chadwick, was safety director at British Petroleum, who have obviously had their share of oil spills and safety issues over the years, and she's brilliant. And lots of people try to measure safety. We try to measure safety with meaningful metrics, and Diane tells us that there is really ultimately one metric that is most useful in measuring safety in a meaningful way in an organization, and it is trust. Trust is the currency of safety. And when people feel like they can speak up, when they trust each other, when they are trusted by their colleagues and by their supervisors, and where we have a workplace that is centered around trust and maintaining the primacy of that is a really meaningful way to measure safety. So that's just a little nugget for you to think about. What is the role of trust, and how is your metric? How are you doing with trust in your workplace at the moment? So I think that brings us, do you want to add anything before we go to the resources, Gina?
No, but I mean, I love that. And I agree with that trust is not only the currency of safety, but trust is really the gateway to putting in all these foundational, important aspects that help you have a thriving, healthy cultural organization, organizational culture. So, yep, I think I love that.
So we've got a couple of resources here for you. If you've enjoyed these discussions about organizational culture and psychological safety and just some of the principles around operationally building these things into your risk management plans at your organization, here's a few books that you might be interested in. Amy Edmondson is brilliant. I'm actually currently reading The Fearless Organization and really enjoying it. I have a book that came out in 2021, which is called Beneficial Risks. It's based on the idea that risk is not a bad thing, and that we need to optimize the risks in our outdoor programs in order to achieve our missions and get the most out of it while managing the undesired risks. And I'll drop a link into the chat here so you can learn more about that book. And then the late Ed Schein has many books, and this is one of his really more influential ones that's now in its 5th edition, about organizational culture and your role as leaders in the organization. So just a couple nuggets here that we hope will be useful resources for you. And then that brings us to our conclusion. I'll turn that over to you, Gina. You're muted, Gina.
Thank you. So important when we're looking at policies and procedures. When I'm talking with some of our clients, it is very unsexy work, and people roll their eyes. And when I have done webinars on policies and procedures before, I try to find ways to keep the audience engaged, because it can be very dry. But besides protecting corporate liability, which I feel like for the last 30 years, that's the basis and the concern around policies and procedures, is making sure we have the absolute minimum to protect ourselves and the corporation according to whatever state or federal law there may be on the issue. And you can see from that perspective, you wouldn't include things that aren't a concern for liability or legality, like more psychological safety aspects, like a disrespect or a respectful code of conduct in your policies. Rather, you would only focus on the absolute things that protect the organization. But what I think is exciting and fruitful about a really comprehensive policy and corresponding procedures is that you have an opportunity to embed in your organization the values that your corporation already has. You started doing this work for a reason, and you've got really good values that you can bring to life through your policies and procedures. And so I feel like looking at policies and procedures in a broader way that help move your organization and the culture of your organization in the direction that you want to. And so, as pertaining to psychological safety and then the necessary trust, there's ways to build that in to your organization that helps everyone be on the same page, helps move the culture in your organization based on your values forward. And it helps in organizations that have a lot of turnover, and you have, you're working on retention, or your seasonal workforce. You have a document that starts really from your values and then broadens out how you want to see behavior in your organization through your policies and procedures. So I'm a big fan, despite the fact that most people find policies and procedure work very boring, as I bet you find as well, Steve. But those of us doing this work, we see the creative side of policies and procedures. And so that's why I think this is so wonderful. And this goes to, building trust through your policies and procedures in order to implement all these other aspects that you want to see in your culture. So you do things like not having a zero tolerance policy. You have a reporting avenue that is multi-pronged. There's lots of different ways to report. You might provide a anonymous reporting process. And so you build in these cultural elements that ultimately lead to the protection of not only the organization, but the folks in the organization. And so I think that is so important. Do you want to add to any of these things, Steve?
I'm kind of itching to move on to hear what people think in Q&A, but I'll just make a quick comment on the anonymous reporting process.
Yes.
Which is like obviously so needed. It's especially needed in an organization that might be sort of trying to get out of the blame cycle, right? Trying to move on from that place where it's not safe, for people to speak up and voice their concerns. And I have this idealistic notion that in the trust loop, we don't need an anonymous reporting system. People wouldn't be afraid to put their name on a report because they would be celebrated and thanked for reporting something instead of punished. So I think the anonymity is really important way to get from one to the other, but I wonder if it in and of itself might be a goal to outgrow it, outgrow the need for anonymity. If
That's
you
right.
think that's, I realize that's not where most organizations are at the moment, but just a comment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's what we always would say working with crisis centers. We're trying to put ourselves out of business.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, exactly.
So why don't we open up to question and answers? If y'all, well, we'll have the answers hopefully, but
yeah,
some questions y'all might have.
Maybe we could even stop sharing the screen and get all the faces back up on the, there we go. Wonderful. Yeah, what do people take away, or what do you see as sort of like good idea, but maybe really hard to implement in your organization, or just something that you would like to discuss further? Byron.
Hey, thank you very much for the presentation. I just have a question in regards to assessing organizational cultures. Do you have any kind of tried and true methodology that you've experienced? In our organization, we've used anonymous surveys and such, and sometimes we just get back the hey, thumbs up, everything's okay, even whether it's anonymous or attributed or whatever. I'm just kind of curious as far as your assessment procedures that you've found successful.
You go first, Gina, and then I might add in a thought or two.
Well, we utilize something called a climate survey. And depending on what the client needs, we start with a climate survey, which really takes a snapshot of the climate of the organization. It asks very detailed questions, particularly around trust. It asks it's trying to get at the same question, but in different ways. And that's really important because people view things from different angles. And so you really want to ask more specific questions. Our survey allows for write-in answers. So people often, depending on how much somebody wants to participate, people will write paragraphs about an answer, which is really helpful to get an idea of what people are thinking. You also see there are factions sometimes in an organization. You get a cluster of responses that are all kind of the same, and a cluster of responses that are all negatively kind of the same. And so that's helpful in not only figuring out what people are thinking, but that there are different camps of thought and there's some division. We do a survey also on unwelcome behaviors in the workplace to get more specific to what we do. And we have found that we need to broaden the questions as far as defining what people think is an unwanted behavior. So you need to ask a question multiple ways around what sexual harassment is because if people don't have a definition of sexual harassment right in front of them, we all have our own ideas of what sexual harassment is. And what I've noticed is that most people feel like most of the behavior that legally is harassment isn't considered harassment. And so I feel like this also contributes to people saying, I haven't experienced sexual harassment because I don't look at it that way. I look at it from a different perspective, but by the law, it is sexual harassment. So it's interesting when you ask the question multiple different ways and give different examples, people are like, oh, yeah, I would never have said that I have either perpetrated or experienced sexual harassment. But when I see it like this, I realize, oh, wow, yeah, I have. And then along those lines, I often see that sexual harassment is just clumped in with sexual assault. There's no delineation between I've experienced this kind of behavior, so it's sexual harassment, because I hear about that in the workplace. I don't hear about rape in the workplace. So I just consider it all sexual harassment. But as we know, technically, when there is touching in an erogenous zone, and this, I'm using this generically because some states are different, but for the most part, when we're talking about touching, we're in the realm of sexual assault now, which of course is criminal. And that necessitates the question of what are you going to do now as an employer? Are you going to get law enforcement involved? What if the person who reported doesn't want law enforcement involved? How do you comport all of this? And so we use climate surveys, but we do them creatively, in my opinion, asking a lot of different questions because people don't have the same definitions or ideas in their mind. So you want to make sure you're asking it in an open-ended way. And I like encouraging people to write in responses because I feel like that gives you so much more of an idea of what's happening on the ground. And can I just add, we also use climate surveys or recommend climate surveys to our organizations who are utilizing anonymous reporting. So when companies have an anonymous reporting option, what we know from anonymous reporting is oftentimes there's not enough information in the anonymous report to conduct an investigation, which of course is the law. When you get a report of sexual harassment, you must conduct an investigation. But with anonymous reporting, you just may not get enough facts. And then you don't have anybody's name tagged to that report, so you can't go back for clarification. And we feel that when you then instantly, so your hands are kind of tied. What can you do? You don't know who these people are, but you've been put on notice that you may have a problem in your organization. So when you put out a flash survey on sexual harassment or unwanted behaviors generally, and you start asking people what they feel is going on, oftentimes you find that this issue is bubbling to the top and you get much more information. So this helps when you're doing an assessment of an organization at the get-go to see where you fall on, the trust levels in your organization. But you also can utilize it in other ways when you have problems, but you're not sure where they're coming from, what's happening, but you want to utilize it as a way to send it out. And then, of course, you're relying on this culture of trust to get these surveys back that will help you understand your culture of trust, right? You're relying on people who have, hopefully that there's enough trust in the organization that they'll take the time to adequately fill out the survey and care enough to give their feedback. So it can perpetuate itself as a problem if people aren't going, if there's not enough trust for somebody to care about returning the survey.
Let's hear from the hand that's raised, please. River Management Society. Yes. You need to unmute.
I have to figure out how to unraise my hand, but thanks so much for joining us. I know Gina, we've not met. Steve, I'd love your advice since you do this broadly across different types of outdoor, specialties or outdoor recreation groups. We have as the A-Collaborative and with our trainers, and not all of us are trainers, have proposed the importance of this sort of training, whether it's specific to sexual harassment, if it leaks into sexual assault, and then largely deals with power imbalances in groups and things like that,
Mhm.
and have gotten lots of, get the nod head and this is important. And every once in a while, every 6 weeks, there's some news, and the news from the Department of Defense or
Mhm.
from West Point or something. Like, it's very important. And then we go down a path, and then there's no money for it. So that tells you where the priority is.
Mhm.
Until and at times I almost wish there was an emergency that would force the
Mhm.
spending to come out of the legal department instead of the program department.
Mhm.
So just wonder if you have any, I know it's not like a 2-minute tip, but suggestions for us to shift where the presentation of the opportunity to fix culture or adjust culture, so that they'll say it is important, and dang it, we really should prioritize this for next year, because we're struggling with that.
Well, I don't think we need an emergency to suddenly appear on this topic, because I think it's already here. I think if you just look at the statistics of, studies that have shown the prevalence of harassment and sexual assault in outdoor spaces, and what are the things in the outdoors that uniquely make that more likely to happen, because of the remoteness and because of the power dynamics and because of the sort of a lot of us in this industry like live in the backs of our trucks, and we're kind of on the fringes of society already, and there's just a lot of things that the I would say that the emergency that you're wanting to use as a catalyst is actually already here, and that how do we do a better job of translating that into visibility and investment and action on the part of folks who may not feel that urgency? Why don't they? Gina has something to say on that topic, I think.
No, but to present that to
Yeah.
create a shift in the dynamic,
Mhm.
instead of, oh yeah, it's really important, but we don't have the
Mhm.
money now.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So it's a little bit on us to position it and provide statistics besides just the topic.
I just attended a conference in Salt Lake City last week, the Wilderness Risk Management Conference. Excellent conference, in case any of you are ever interested in going. But there was one session after another on this very topic, and how important it is, and how training and resources and energy is needed. And there's a lot of resources there. Yeah, feel free to follow up with me if I can support it anyway in connecting you to some of that research.
Yeah, no, it's a big problem. We feel your pain, Risa, collectively. And the business case is right there. There is a case, and statistics have bore out this issue, that this is a serious problem. It also parallels the other concern, besides money being allocated. We really do need leadership to be involved in these shifts, in these cultural shifts. And what we found through research is, if leadership doesn't practice the things that you've now implemented in your policies, then it's going to fail. So maybe you have some leaders who are into it, and they maybe engage to try and start this work, but it's not fully funded. And so, just like I talked about the sexual harassment trainings that droned on and on about all the bad things you shouldn't do and how that had negative consequences, it really can be a gut punch to an organization when you just do the smallest and you start an initiative, but the leaders aren't involved. They aren't participating. They aren't promoting this culture of trust. They aren't using bystander intervention. And they are all most of the problem. Then any money you've spent on that initiative is really wasted, because it is the frontline employees who are looking to the leaders for guidance on how they should be acting. And if this is a new rollout and a new training on the new policy and procedures shift, it's going to fail. And so you've got a money problem, and you have to have leadership involved.
Yeah.
And so that's a whole nother strategy on how You bring along leadership because, as we know, sometimes these leaders are folks who've never experienced these problems themselves. So there isn't an urgency. They don't have any personal experience with it. And so they're like, let's move on to the important stuff. But
Thank you so much. Appreciate.
Imagine an organization that's doing the trust loop from the middle management down, and then the blame cycle from the leadership down to the middle management. How's that going to work? Where people at the front lines are encouraged to speak up when you have concerns and voice your needs and report your near misses and be vulnerable. And then when it rolls up to the head of HR, they fire that person, for speaking up. It doesn't work, right? So I think Gina's point about the leadership, there needs to be an alignment of philosophical understanding of the importance of these things, the importance of psychological safety in an organization, or else there's a glass ceiling on how far it can really go.
Yeah, thank you.
And it looks like we're at time. So thank you, everybody, for listening to us and participating. And we are thrilled to be here. And we'll try to get out more information on A- if there's going to be further. Steve and I are talking about going on the road, doing some podcasts on this issue. So we'll let you know if that comes to fruition, and you can listen to us talk more. But thanks.
Wonderful to be here with you all. Thanks for inviting me, and I really appreciated the engagement, and I'm happy to follow up with anyone afterwards if there's any questions. So thanks again, folks.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And if you weren't able to join us at the beginning, I will be sending this out, the recording. I'll be processing it this afternoon and sending it out to everyone who registered. So in case you want to go back and check any of it out or share it with anyone that might find it beneficial. So. All right. Well, thanks again, Steve and Gina and everyone else. And I hope you have a great rest of your week.